Hello, everyone. We slowly make our way into our little virtual town hall for what should be a pretty interesting discussion about the world of technology and what's happened over the summer and over the last couple of weeks. My name's Peter Lewis, and I'm joined here by my partners in crime, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch. Hi, Lizzie.
Hi.
And Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia.
Hi, folks.
We'll just all pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, traditional owners. I'm on the land of the Eora Nation Gadigal people, and wherever we are, pay those respects and recognise the land was never ceded. For those that are new, please have your camera on, please use the chat. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of different views, I think, canvassed today, particularly around the media bargaining code, and it's going to be great if we can share ideas and use this space for what it was intended, which is an exchange of opinions and trying to find common ground on how we move forward and get our heads around what is complex policy, but really important policy. So for those that have been asleep over summer, the big shifts, as you know, there's been new laws passed through the Parliament, which will force Google and Facebook to reach agreements with media companies under the threat of compulsory arbitration to value public interest journalism. It comes off the back of the broader report from Rod Sims that found that Google and Facebook are exercising monopoly power in Australia, and there's a range of measures he recommended, one of which was this news bargaining code. It has not been uncontroversial. As you know, it has had a huge backlash from the big tech platforms. Facebook pulled down content this time last week. The final legislation has amendments in it, and depending where you sit, that is either stared down Facebook's threats or rendered the legislation less effective than it would have been. I think, you know, let's hear those different perspectives. So I guess there's three bits here. A, is this a useful exercise? B, has it delivered what it intended to? And C, where do we go next? So let's start with that sort of helicopter view of, has it done what it set out to do, and was that something worth doing? And Dan, I'll start with you because you've been up to your neck in it. No, Guardian Australia supported the code, and I think at the moment in the position of saying you'll be beneficiaries of the code, but do you want to just sort of give your perspective on what's happened over the last few months?
Sure. It's been a pretty busy few months, hasn't it? Look, I think everyone, or at least many of the people that have joined these sessions before, know my position on the code and the reasons why I think the platforms should pay, so I'm not going to revisit that. I guess our take on it, though, now that the code is now law and passed yesterday, is that, look, it was a pretty imperfect process to get here, but I think the purpose of the code is going to be fulfilled. I think the ability for the Treasurer of the day to designate Google and Facebook services at a later stage is a significant threat, and it is that regulatory environment which has facilitated already some really good commercial agreements, including one with the Guardian of Australia and Google. And I suspect that over the next few months, we're going to see a lot more deals done between Google and Facebook, and not only the big publishers, but the little publishers. And I guess that will be the test. I'm conscious that there's been lots of criticism of the code of this only supporting the big end of media. Given who's done deals so far, I guess there's some truth to that. I truly believe that we'll see over the coming months that there'll be a lot more publishers, large and small, which are going to come on board and do deals between Google and Facebook. I just want to indulge me for 1 second, Pete, because I just want to take one quick step back and just remind everyone why I think the code is good. I'm not going to go into the specifics of payment or those things that I said, but I just want to remind people of one thing. So without wanting to get too carried away, perhaps I will. The best thing about the internet is that it removed the gatekeeper role, right? And so anyone with a blog could get their voice out there, and social media has really enabled that more than anything. However, the worst thing about the internet is that it also removed the gatekeeper role. And because what that's enabled is that when you're scrolling through your Facebook newsfeed or you're on YouTube or whatever, there's not really that much of a difference between watching a Guardian video, for example, and watching a conspiracy theory video. And that has what has enabled all these sort of conspiracy theories and misinformation and everything to run rife. The reason why I support the code broadly and why I think it's actually good for democracy, again, perhaps getting carried away, is because I think the best antidote for that is fact-based journalism. And so journalism is a craft. The ability to distill really complex information in 600 or 800 words or a short video is hard to do. There's a reason why cadet journalists get put onto, covering local sporting rounds and those sorts of things in the beginning as they learn their craft. It's hard to do this. It is something different. Lizzie, I know you and I differ on this, but I think this is why I'm supportive of it, is that I think that, yes, if this code results in a lot more funding for journalism, and I believe that it will, that is the best antidote we have for the misinformation which has run rife. And therefore, from the Guardian's perspective, and I'll finish my monologue, we've done a deal with Google that's substantial. We're really happy with it. We're in talks with Facebook. The result of this is that we're going to employ a lot more journalists, and I think that's going to be good for Australia broadly. So I'll leave it there.
Lizzie, return serve.
There's much to say. I'm just going to post in the chat a piece I got up in the New York Times yesterday. So I was very grateful for the New York Times letting me have space to discuss this, because I wasn't
That might be the only news outlet in the world that's run the counter view. I must say it has been, I recognise it's been a bit of one-way traffic in the public debate over this. Surprise, surprise.
Indeed. To their credit, Sydney Morning Herald ran a piece by one of our great campaigners at Digital Rights Watch, Sam Floriani. Yeah, so I'll find that in a minute, and I can post that too. But in general, it's been a very frustrating position being a critic of this, because you're confronting a set of politicians who like to tarnish you with the same brush as Facebook, or media who likes to get on its high horse and explain the importance of what they do to democracy. I mean, I've got a lot of worries about the code. It's set out in that op-ed. I just thought I may as well pick up on what you said, Dan, because I've had many opportunities to canvass it here, but I am actually very worried about the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, whatever you want to call it. And one of my concerns about actually the gatekeeper role being reinstated through something like Google Showcase or whatever the Facebook news product ends up being is that one of the organisations that will get platformed in there as legitimate news is going to be Sky News. So I think, to the Guardian's credit, they did a great piece a couple of days ago analysing the immense malicious potential of Sky News in terms of peddling misinformation, platforming climate deniers. I mean, I did a podcast with someone in Canada who was shocked that Sky News now has a contributor, Lauren Southern, who was a known alt-writer, believed in the Great Replacement theory. So, these are very serious extremists that would not get platformed anywhere else in the world. They come to Australia because they know they'll get a platform on Sky after dark. And those people are now going to have an added level of legitimacy because they will have passed through the relevant requirements to become a gatekeeper. And so I think we do have to think about the problem of misinformation and disinformation in the context of it not just being a social media problem, but also a mainstream media problem. And we have to think about ways to manage that now, because it will become more egregious, in my view. And this is the kind of thing that in a few years' time we'll wonder why there's more extremism in our society, when we've allowed these kinds of people to have platforms that are not just influential among politicians, which is usually how Sky News is thought of, but now also does very well for social media. One of the reasons why I think Facebook negotiated these last-minute amendments that allowed their behaviour in this marketplace to be considered in a more nuanced way. So instead of having to do deals with everybody, they can now make claims that they've done deals with certain people, and that should be enough for the purposes of being reasonable, or for the purposes of levelling the playing field between platforms and media. One of the reasons I think Facebook pushed for that is because they can see that something like Sky News content will do very well on their platform that neatly aligns with their business model, in a way that lots of other investigative journalism, regional and rural journalism won't. And so I mean, I can tell you why I thought the code was bad and didn't do the job of incentivising quality journalism or holding tech to account, because I don't think it does, or why users were missing from the equation of how you come up with this policy. But I think the proof will be in the pudding. And I remember predicting a little while back, there was a journalist who was asking, what do you think is going to happen with this code? I said, I think it's going to be passed. I think there'll be a bunch of unintended consequences that take a very long time to fix. And I stand by that. I think we're going to see these consequences unfold over time. And of course, the proof will be in the pudding, but I don't want to be right. I would love to see a more diverse, robust media. I would love to see the elevation of voices that have come about as a result of the amazing technology of the internet, and all sorts of interesting niche blogs and video channels and newsletters and stuff that have come out of this digital age. I want to see that kind of thing elevated, because I think that is part of having a diverse, robust media. And I'm very worried that is not what we're going to see over the next little while. And so I think it's our job now, especially those who supported it, to be the attack dogs on the worst excesses that are going to be elevated by this policy, and argue in defence of users, in defence of rights, as against now both tech platforms and media companies who have an interest in maintaining this system. And I think it's our job to kind of advocate for human rights in online spaces as a counterweight to that.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. And where I totally agree with you is that if this is all that happens, I do think that that is a real risk. And to the point of where are the voices of consumers in this, part of, let's go back to the ACCC report, which this was one of dozens of recommendations. And cynically, we know why it's the first recommendation to roll out. But there is also in train privacy review, disinformation and misinformation requirements, which is at the moment looking like an industry written, industry enforced, do nothing code. But there is definitely a trigger there for tighter regulation behind that. And we'll talk about also the ad tech inquiry, but also funding for tax deductibility for public interest journalism, digital literacy. So the reason the Australia Institute backed it in was that we saw the package of reforms as being important in toto, and that this was the first best chance to get the ball rolling. But if it is all it is, I think a lot of your concerns are totally valid, notwithstanding that it will make both The Guardian and Murdoch stronger. My only thing is I'm not sure it changes the way News Limited operates, but it does resource other players to hold them more to account. But, again, the proof is going to be in the fullness of time. So let's park that for a moment. Anyone that wants to read the whole inquiry, I just reread it or rescanned it last night. And it's what's really interesting is you've got to really pull out your microscope to actually find the recommendation for the bargaining code. Like it's not a report that says we need a bargaining code. It is a report that says we need to deal with the monopoly power of Google and Facebook and their impact on Australia. And I think it's really important that stays, in people's gaze, because I think you commented to me last night, the media is really good at focusing on themselves, and it happened with encryption, it's happened with surveillance. And once the media is dealt with, there is often a sense that the caravan moves on to the next thing, of this next moment of self-interest. Yeah.
I think that's me. I think it would be defaming Dan to say that that's what he said.
No, that's what I said. I was speaking to you last night, Lizzie. Dan.
Yes, it was me. I know sometimes as a digital rights activist, I get a bit frustrated because journalists will, I spent a lot of time talking about the importance of journalists being able to use digital technology securely, free from surveillance from government. And you argue that because they're a special category, of course, but it's part of a general campaign for privacy and for freedom from surveillance. And then it sometimes feels like the journalists waltz in at the last minute, secure themselves an exception, and then wander away. And you're left going, what about everybody else? And I would love to see a bit more solidarity from journalists. So this is where the rubber hits the road. This absolutely. Is where we want to see that happen. And I'm well, let's see if past conduct is a predictor of future conduct.
Few quick questions from the room. Either of you that think you can answer it, please answer. Do News Limited and 9 get 95% of the total?
No.
Well, that stat's been floating around, but I think that's based on deals already done, right? But that may not be the sum.
That would be inaccurate.
But there is a problem that we will never know because they're commercially in confidence.
That is true, yeah.
I would like to see a review process in 12 months where there is at least some accountability for what's been done with the money, because basically this has been government on behalf of us, citizen intervention in a market for the public interest. So maybe Dan will find a way of at least sharing what's happened in The Guardian, or will we just see it from all the new journalists you hire?
Well, no, I'm happy to talk about it. Look, the deals are commercial in confidence. So I'm not going to be able to say the amount that we're getting, other than it is substantial. It's a substantial proportion of our investment in journalism today. I don't know if it's going to reassure you in particular enough, Lizzie, or everyone, but we are already, as a result of this deal, we are already planning for hiring more journalists off the back of this. That is already in train. And so I think you're going to see in the coming weeks and months, you're going to see a lot more journalists being hired from The Guardian, and I suspect from other organisations as well. Look, I just want to echo what you said earlier, Pete, and I think it was your point as well, Lizzie. I completely acknowledge that the media has had a dog in this fight, right? Has therefore been campaigning for the media code above and beyond everything else is the most important thing. I truly believe that privacy is at least equal to it, and that's probably the next thing that we really need to focus on. What our journalists do is completely up to Lenore. I have no influence over that, our editor. But for what it's worth, me personally, I truly believe that privacy is the next thing, which is the most important, and we need to fight for that. And I certainly will be doing that for what it's worth. Let's see if the rest of the media picks up and campaigns on this issue as much as they have for the media code. Look, I suspect we all won't, but I do know that Lenore, our editor, is concerned about these issues as well. So I think you're going to see a lot more reporting, and crucially, we're going to have stacks more journalists to be able to do this kind of reporting. So more journalists to be able to hold the tech platforms to account as well. So let's see what happens. The proof's going to be in the pudding, I guess.
Question from Dean. The deal between Guardian and Google using a capability was already operating outside of Australia. Surely there was no need for legislation to do this? No,
I think, what can I say? I have to be a little bit careful here, right, because of confidentiality. But look, we have been in discussions or negotiations, if you like, with Google for a number of years without the regulatory pressure that came with this code. We would not have secured such a favourable deal, and so I do think the code was fundamental. It was a pretty imperfect process, as I said at the start. Some of the amendments that have been made we're not thrilled with, but I think the integrity of the code remains, and that threat is significant. That threat of designation is significant, and that is what has resulted in us all getting substantial deals with the platforms and hopefully with Facebook to come.
There's also concerns from some smaller publishers, and I think these are really valid. Giles Parkinson, who's a good mate of mine from Renew Economy, has basically been told by Google Showcase, we don't want your stuff. So his concern is twofold. They're out, but also their fear is that they will, those that are in Showcase will have an algorithmic advantage in search, and he's always relied on search to find his readers. I think this is, the plight of small publishers is really, really important here, and it's not just about a deal, but it's also about treatment. I'd always thought Google Showcase, and I still think it was a fig leaf to do negotiations without agreeing there was value in search. But I think the bigger risk is that now they've paid for something, that now they work out a way of monetizing it, and they do create effectively their own walled news site. So I'm interested again in your perspective there, Lizzie, and then back to Dan on how Guardian will ensure that's not where you end up being a serf to the big tech companies that are now paying for more of your operations. Lizzie?
Yeah, I think that is a really big problem, and Facebook and Google will get to pick favorites, which is why I am so worried about Sky, because you can see the business model in Facebook and Sky aligning so neatly in terms of viral content, extremist content, kind of content that keeps you on a platform. I mean, Sky's made for social media. So, that's one of my worries, that why would you, as Facebook, prioritize regional development, regional journalists? Why would you prioritize specialist beats and the like? And why would the government go to the bother of using this quite complex legislative stick where they get to designate a platform if they haven't done the right thing? But Facebook gets the opportunity as well to have a month's notice, so it can again pull the rug out from under publishers and stop news content sharing, which is what it just did. I mean, I think that amendment that Facebook got is very damaging to the collective idea of the code. I don't like the whole thing, but if I was in the media, I'd be also very alarmed about that amendment, because it essentially undermines its collectivity. And it means that there will be some people who these companies get to play favourites with, and people who are left out in the cold. And that's deeply disappointing. I mean, the other thing I think that is good about the removal of gatekeepers, I mean, I guess Dan and I have a fundamental philosophical disagreement there, but is the serendipity of the internet as well. That, you know, getting news is not just from the traditional set of mastheads that accommodate your country. One of the great things about the internet is that you can now watch YouTube channels that cover all sorts of obscure areas of the world, or parts of the world that are very important but aren't Australian, and you can learn a lot. And that it feels very disappointing that that's not going to be prioritised, because essentially if you weren't producing content that was primarily for an Australian audience, then you wouldn't be able to register as a news organisation for the purposes of the code, news business. So there'll be a prioritisation that occurs in that way, which could produce a kind of localism and parochialism that I think is really what we don't need at this present moment either. So I am worried about that. And I think, yeah, the right thing for the journos to be doing now, I think, would be agitating for regional stuff. I mean, the last thing I'll say about this as well is that part of the antidote to this would be increased funding for the ABC. I'm nervous because I think this is a now private source of revenue that could justify funding cuts by a Liberal government. I would like to see those funds kind of earmarked for a particular purpose rather than just going into general revenue and therefore justifying.
I think they are. I think ABC
that would be good.
Says it's going to be regional.
Yeah, well, so that's good. So,
yeah.
You know, I don't think it should never be considered a substitute.
Absolutely not.
So, you know, that's the other part of this, I suppose, is that you expect the state broadcaster to fill those gaps to some degree. And so hopefully we will see that. But I don't know why we couldn't just throw heaps of money at the ABC. I think that would be electorally popular. The only people it doesn't wash with is politicians. So, yeah, there's an institutional interest there against it.
Hey, Dan, is Guardian now beholden to Google and Facebook, and how do you ensure that you're not getting yourself locked into and their infrastructure rather than your own?
I think that we are already locked into their infrastructure, and this just gives us a fighting chance. So nothing in this code changes the dynamic. In my view, again, I think, Lizzie, we disagree on this. I think that Google and Facebook control where people go online. That's the point of the code. And I don't think anything mandating that they have to make payment to news publishers doesn't change that dynamic in any way. I think it is a pragmatic way of dealing with it. We've sparred on this before on Twitter, Lizzie. I think I think this is a pragmatic way of dealing with their power from Australia, where we don't have the ability to break them up. I just make one other comment, though, if I could. One of the minimum standards in the code was that they had to give advance notice of algorithm changes to news publishers. I've said this publicly. I said this at the Senate hearing. I think that this idea that these algorithms should be a complete secret is ludicrous. I think it's ludicrous. And I think this line that that we can't tell anyone about it because it will enable people to game it just doesn't wash anymore. These algorithms run the digital economy. So yes, I'm pleased that publishers are going to receive advance notice of algorithm changes. But I'd also make the point, why don't we make that available to everybody? Why don't we make that available to every business? I would fully support that. There is no reason why we shouldn't. These algorithms are too
because
important.
it's like giving the community notice that you're building a new road through their suburb or something, isn't it? Like,
Are you going to leak it, Dan? Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying. But
sounds like it is. I'm joking.
But I am going to advocate strongly and publicly that this should be, as I'm doing today, that this is something that should be available to all. I think it's too important. These algorithms are way too important. Can I just make one more point, which I think is where your question started, Peter, and then no doubt you'll want to move on. The concern, I completely appreciate everyone's concerns about this only benefiting the big end of town and, for example, Renew Economy not being the beneficiary of this code. What I would suggest to all of those publishers like Renew Economy and all the smaller ones is, if you go on and get yourself authorised under the Australian Communications and Media Authority, so you pass the content test, the revenue test, the Australian audiences test, and the professional standards test. If you pass those 4 tests, I think they're pretty elegant in concept, by the way, to determine what is actually a news publisher and what isn't. If you were to go and pass those tests, and then Google and Facebook were to say to you, no, we're not going to do a deal, even though that's technically possible, Lizzie, I think it would be remarkable. I think they would get so much heat from that. that I think they would have to back down. If they don't, I mean, then I guess all of your concerns have been proven right. So let's see. But that would be what I would encourage everyone to do.
Yeah, I think there should be mass registration. I think that is a good idea. Like if I was the Courier Mail, I'd be registering. Anyway.
And you'd be hoping that is public too, the registration. But let's move on, because the other thing that obviously happened was Facebook did launch a hostile attack on Australia, and whether or not you think the laws are the answer to the problems they've set out to solve, the wake up call was the power of Facebook. I in my naivety, I thought I could get a bit of a boycott going of Facebook advertising over the weekend, but apart from the federal government, no one wanted in, because everyone's so reliant on these platforms, particularly the progressive movement, to reach their audiences, to raise funds, to build lists. Even though 50% of Australians are on it, it's the measurable marketing-based way of building audiences, which you can induce a click, you can get a sign up, and they're on your email list, so your emails can go to spam. You guys at Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie, despite your skepticism of the bargaining code, has taken the very principled call of removing yourself from Facebook this week. Explain why, and explain what your workarounds are going to be.
Well, of course, despite being critics of the code and objecting to it when it was put, we are very critical of Facebook's decision. We think it's pretty disgraceful to essentially strip many community organisations, charitable organisations of their capacity to share news for a variety of reasons without notice. We think it's weaponising users to improve the bargaining position of a massive tech giant, and that's completely unacceptable. So our view is, we want to try and build an alternative in the abstract, but also in what we do on an everyday basis. We're trying to make sure our community knows that we don't support the actions of Facebook, but we're also trying to build up our resilience. One of my big concerns about this particular episode was that it shows that if you are a community or charitable organisation, you rely on Facebook at your peril, and cultivating a dependence like that is actually extremely dangerous. So I think progressives, social movements, community organisations should be looking at alternative ways to build and maintain their communities. I mean, I put an article in the chat actually about a news business that's done something similar in New Zealand, and their objection was around the treatment of Christchurch, which I thought was pretty impressive, and they've actually not suffered significant consequences. So I think we can work more to start building these alternatives, and it's not always going to be smooth sailing or advantageous, but I think in the long run it makes us stronger and protects us from the whims of Mark Zuckerberg, which is I think vitally important at this point in time.
So how do you get your next 200 signups, or do you stop using the size of a list as the matrix of success? Because one of the things that has struck me over time is that advocacy has never actually worked out how to measure its success. So they've proxied in marketing talk. So
yeah,
you know what I'm saying? Like, and marketing loves Facebook because it's measurable and because it's all bits of data. But what is your alternate plan to build your movement?
One thing I would say is that we're lucky enough to be funded by largely foundations to date, and that you can push back against, for example, Facebook shares as being some kind of metric of your success. So I think you've got work to do with funders. You can also make a claim to your members to say, well, we need your donations to be able to continue the work we do, because we're not able to access larger audiences through Facebook. I mean, I think actually the primary way through which we engage with our members is through our email list. And so it's not actually that critical to our success in any event.
Except you hear a lot of people say, Facebook gets us our donors because we can hone in. Yeah.
I think also you're potentially closing yourself off to other donors if that's the only way you think about it. I think you don't have the luxury now of becoming dependent on Facebook. And I think also you potentially are closing yourself off to other opportunities if you are. And I think there's a lot of structural change that has to happen in the NGO sector. So it's not just going to be one small action that kind of precipitates the whole movement. I think lots of us need to start changing how we behave, interact with, with foundations, as I mentioned, with each other. We do quite a bit of work, as you know, Peter, in terms of talking to non-profit community organisations and progressive businesses about how to manage their data responsibly, how to take steps to avoid holding people's data in an insecure way, like practicing data minimisation, these kinds of things. So we're all going to have to get better at trying to grapple with the profound philosophical problems with engaging with the platform, with the internet in ways that we don't always agree with. So how do you make use of this potential without becoming beholden to it? It's a really important question. We're taking that step because we think it's an important thing to do, and we think ultimately we'll be better off.
Yeah, you know, you get the pushback from some groups that it would be a nice to have, but we're trying to stop the planet from global warming, or there are bigger fights. One of my insights, I think, is that you look at the rise of the surveillance capitalism model on Facebook, and I think the left has stopped winning because I think it ends up creating a very individualated political experience that isn't actually that friendly
collective,
to
not
movement
collective.
building. Yeah, you know what I mean? So I think we do need to think it through differently. And obviously we've been, you know, it's kind of a blank slate because there's nothing else there. And whereas for all its, you know, chutzpah, Bing was an alternate to Google, as was DuckDuckGo. There was no real alternate platform for progressive organisations or governments or anything to reach audiences than Facebook at the moment.
Totally. And the thing I'd add to that is, well, this is how you start demanding one of them. You say, well, we need this infrastructure that isn't profit driven to be able to host a community group. We're going to experiment with other kinds of platforms so you can sort of vote with your feet. The last thing I'll say about that, just to add on what you were talking about then, Peter, is, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, after the last presidential election, she was doing a reflection on campaign building and how, you know, she has this throwaway line in the New York Times where she says, if you're not spending $200,000 a month on Facebook, you're doing something wrong. And I just find that so deeply alarming. I mean, this is someone who I think has done a really great job of intervening into a process that is fully hostile to her and having an enormous impact. But that is like a complacency that I think, you know, we cannot afford to entertain. And we've got to find ways to build alternatives to that. It's too dangerous otherwise.
Yeah, it's like playing inside the game rather than looking at the field. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, just on the Facebook, did the ban have a material impact either on your readership or your income last week?
Yeah, it did. Not so much income, but certainly our audience went down a material amount. I mean, a couple of points to make here. The kind of content that goes well on Facebook tends to be your more sensational content. It tends to be, Lizzie, to your point, it tends to be your Sky News content and those sorts of things. So the publishers that do really well out of Facebook, they get a large amount of their referral traffic from Facebook, are people like the Daily Mail and Sky, and I know 7 News gets a lot of referral from Facebook. The publishers that do, I guess, what I would regard as, this is probably going to offend them, but more serious journalism. So organisations like The Guardian, The Australian, for a different political perspective, we don't get a huge amount of traffic from Facebook compared to some of the others. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I thought it was a pretty appalling decision from Facebook to make. But in a way, it's almost a shame that we haven't seen what was going to happen from this if it had stayed in place for 6 months, because it would have been interesting to see which were the dominant news platforms at the end of all of this process, and whether that sensational clickbaity type journalism got less airtime because of it. But again, I'll bring it back to probably what both of you have touched on before. I mean, what this has shown to us quite obviously is just how reliant we are on Facebook, not just for progressive organisations and organisations like yours, Lizzie, and the like, but just the general population. And that's a real problem, isn't it? I mean, we've gone from having a commercial enterprise running, you know, what should be the public square, but really isn't, I think is a really substantial problem. And Pete, I know you've been advocating for what I thought was a crazy idea at the time, but potentially an organisation like the ABC building out a social network for Australians. The more and more I think about it, the more and more I think this makes perfect sense. I mean, it's too important. This has become too important a piece of sort of communications infrastructure for it to be sitting in the hands, or at least almost exclusively sitting in the hands, of a completely commercial entity based in Silicon Valley that really has proven it doesn't necessarily have our best interests at heart. And so what do we do about that? I mean, this is the moment, Peter. I think that you should be banging the drum loudly about this.
And absolutely, and it's the next bit of work, I think, once the ACCC washes through. Mark Andreevich has joined us. This is the man that called surveillance capitalism 20 years before anyone else saw it coming round the bend. What's been your reflections on the last week and just on this discussion we've been having now, Mark?
I was really interested by Dan's last point, because I think it gets to the heart of one of the key issues here. You know, he said which publications are going to do best, and he's exactly right. These are the publications that are already producing the type of content that the algorithms maximize for. And so I'm curious to hear Dan's thought about this. You know, to what extent does the bargaining code, if it goes ahead, provide incentive for a range of publications, including your own, to say, well, look, actually, we can up our ability to generate revenues from the bargaining code if we craft the type of content that's more like the Daily Mail content that's going to do that. Is there going to be some economic pressure that, in a sense, is, as more and more outlets rely more and more on the platforms, they come to rely more and more on the algorithmic sorting and curating priorities of the platforms? Is that a danger?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question, Mark. But I think look, I don't know what other commercial agreements are being struck between Facebook and the other publishers. I don't know the specifics of it. And again, I have to be a little bit careful about what I say about our discussions. But I will say this, it's not based on links. It's not based on referral traffic. I think I can say this, it's lump sum payments for the broad benefit that Facebook receives. And that includes not just the benefit they receive from our content within the newsfeed and everything else, it also includes the benefit they receive from the fact that they've got share tools on all of our sites and they collect data from that. I mean, that's a whole other issue. We've got problems with that. I agree. I know what you're going to say next, Lizzie. I think that is a big problem. But nonetheless, while we are in this position where we are absolutely reliant on them, and this dynamic is pretty hard to break from Australia, there's all these other benefits which make up those deals, and that's what they're paying for. So there's no incentive in any agreement that we're going to do with Facebook. And I mean, I don't know if the other publishers, but I suspect it's the same, which would say to us, go and produce more clickbait journalism, we're going to give you more fees. The deals are not being struck in that way. And I think that's a pretty important sort of misconception, if you like, that's out there, because otherwise this would be really worrying, right? This would basically be incentivizing the kind of the worst kind of journalism. It's not, in my experience and in our discussions, that's not what it's doing at all, not even close.
That's really useful to hear. I think that's a super important point. And I mean, somewhere lurking in the background is are those organizations that are already more circulated on those platforms likely to get bigger deals? I don't know the answer to that. What are the factors that impact that, which would then kind of have maybe a more indirect influence than the direct, one-to-one, how many links circulate. But I think that's a super important point, and it kind of eases some of the concerns. I think, although down the road, it's hard not to see that the platforms themselves have their own, particular set of commercial priorities, and to the extent that they become kind of cemented in as the distribution platform, it's hard not to envision those priorities, playing an increasingly important role. But your qualifications, I think, are super important ones.
Thanks, Mark. Hey, I think we'll leave the discussion of public digital infrastructure for another day because it's a huge topic. Lizzie, there's a whole bunch of other bits of reform that are moving through the system at the moment. There is a review of ad tech that is live. There is a review of privacy laws, which is going through the AGs. There was an industry code on misinformation and disinformation, and there's also e-safety commissioner legislation going through the House. So it's kind of this wall of changes, and some of them are stops, some of them haven't gone anywhere near where they need to go, others are still works in progress. How do you see all these bits fitting together, and what are the priorities as far as you can see over the next couple of months, moving out of, and I'll set this up, and this will be the naive me speaking. We've just spent a week where people have seen the power of big tech. You've had all these conservative politicians talking about the power of big tech and the need to rein it in, and a media consensus that big tech is a problem. So in terms of building blocks and going to the next step, is there a moment where we can either call out their BS or harness what could be a bit of a, a transformative moment?
Yeah, well, privacy law is kind of an antidote to the business model of big tech, I think. So if we're serious about taking on big tech, which I'm not really convinced the code did that, the way we do that is by protecting people's privacy and trying to undermine that model of data-centric advertising. And, you know, Facebook's model, Google's model of serving up audiences that are highly curated for very specific kinds of markets. So, you know, I would like to see expansive privacy reform. We've obviously provided a submission in relation to the consultation. There's quite a bit in there. It's very general and open. I'm curious to see what the government has an appetite for in terms of reform. You know, in there, for example, is a proposed cause of action for serious invasion of privacy, which I think, you know, forests must have been felled with the number of law reform reports written about that particular topic. I remember I was at the Law Institute in Victoria writing a paper about this and talking to journos about it, because journos were the most worried. That must be 7 or 8 years ago. So some of these things have been hanging around for such a long time. We've got really outdated privacy legislation. I'd like to see reform there. The one that I thought we'd mention, but, you know, depending on how much time we've got to talk about, is the online safety bill. I'll just pop in the chat and explain it that we've done at Digital Rights Watch. I think this is something that's flying below the radar. So, you know, you can talk about the need to convince politicians to take the extra step on privacy. I think one of our big problems in tech policy making is that you talk about children, or you talk about child sex exploitation material, or you talk about terrorism, and basically people just think you've got a blank check to write any kind of legislation you want. And this is what we are seeing potentially with this proposed law. We've put in there why we think there's problems with it and, you know, what our concerns are. But I really want to get to a place where we can talk about tech policy without this kind of moralism, meaning that we're unable to raise objections to very serious powers being introduced for the Online Safety Commissioner, you know, very retro, kind of outdated approaches to classification of material, and therefore kind of unnecessarily harming certain sections of society who use the internet in lawful ways, but perhaps not how everyone would choose to. You know, so there's a very serious issue around what is the role of lawmakers and policing on the internet in these contexts. And I don't feel like the debate's always had on the terrain that I would like to have it on. And so I hope that we can take a mature aspect into that discussion as well. But those are sort of the trends that I see kind of unfolding. You know, potentially a neglect on the part of privacy issues, and then potentially very aggressive behaviour when it comes to expanding surveillance capabilities, which has been two very long-standing themes in tech policy making in recent times.
Dan, what are you looking for out of this moment of, if there is a moment of regulation and it doesn't end with money to media companies? What's the next thing that you want to see?
I mean, we've touched on this a lot, and I think I've said it before, but privacy, I think, is the most important, and I think it will be the most effective bit of regulation that we can do to actually start to rein in some of these problems. So look, there's two things happening at the moment. There's the Attorney General is doing a review of our privacy regulations in Australia, which are woefully inadequate and not built for the digital age. And at the same time, the ACCC is undertaking a second inquiry into the advertising technology space. Now, they're happening sort of in isolation and with different people doing it. I think that's a problem. I think that the way ad tech works, because it is so reliant on data, you can't do one without the other.
Can you just explain to people what ad tech is? Because it took a little while for me to understand, but there's basically, whenever you go to a website that has a banner ad, there is a real-time auction going on for your attention, which is run by a company that Google owns, of which Google picks up the data, even though Google promised when it bought it not to share the data. Is that where we are?
I mean, yeah, that's pretty good summary. By the way, I've worked in this for 20 years and I still don't understand it. It's hugely complicated, right? But yeah, I mean, that's so every time you visit a website, whether that's the Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever, and you see those banner ads, almost always, not exclusively, but almost always, the ads that you see, there's this, you know, real-time bidding that goes on in the background, and different advertisers will bid on how much they want to pay effectively to target that ad to you, the consumer. And there's all this stuff that gets built into that. So everyone brings their own sort of data capabilities into that. There's all these third parties that are involved. There can be scores of different companies and data points and brand safety points and all these things that kind of get fed into that auction to determine who wins the auction. And it's hugely complicated. I'll probably confuse everyone more by explaining that. But anyway, the issue at the heart of it, right? The issue at the heart of it is that what the ACCC has found in their interim report in this is that the pipes, if you like, that connect the advertisers with the publishers' advertising inventory are controlled almost exclusively by Google. Not totally, but almost exclusively. And Google has about 80% of the advertiser clients on one side, and they've got about 100%, almost 100% of the publisher ad inventory on the other. And so there's, what the agency has found is there's an incentive for Google. They didn't find that they're doing this, but they found that there is an incentive for Google to preference their own advertisers to the detriment of other ad tech providers in this space, if you like. Look, it's
Why
hugely
do I care
complicated.
about that? Why do I care about that?
Look, the key point is this, right? What the thing that underpins all of that is consumer data, right? The thing that makes this work is
we're the
consumer
petrol.
data.
Our attention is the petrol that runs it.
And the problem is that the way data is collected and used is almost completely unregulated. It's the Wild West. The way to solve this deserves a whole other tech talk, by the way, where we should focus just on this. But the way to solve this,
we'll have a big crowd for that one.
Yeah, it might just be you, me, and Lizzie talking. But the way to solve this, I think, with purpose limitations. Purpose limitations are kryptonite. I'll explain what they mean. So, for example, it is completely unreasonable. No consumer should expect that Google is reading your Gmail for the purpose of selling you targeted advertising when you visit The Guardian. And yet that is what currently happens. Similarly, no consumer should expect that where they use their credit card around town should be used to power advertisements that you might see on the Sydney Morning Herald. And that is what currently happens. So the way to solve this is by, no amount of consumer consent or anything around these sort of things should make that possible. It should just be illegal. It should be illegal to do that. And if you do that, you start to substantially break down the power and the data arms race that exists online. You begin to substantially undermine, I guess, this kind of surveillance imperative that exists within advertising. And then we can have a debate about where to draw the line around what those purpose limitations should be and what should be legal and what shouldn't. I suspect I'm going to have a different view to Lizzie, for example, of what that line should be. But I think the principle should be the same. There is no way that these companies should be allowed to create apps for the specific purpose of just harvesting consumer data. It's the wrong way to go about it.
What do you reckon, Lizzie?
I understand what you're saying. I mean, like an example is that 730 recently revealed, or it's a little while ago, that NAB was selling data to a third-party data miner who then on-sold it to Sportsbet. Sportsbet has a $500 million digital advertising budget. It's highly integrated, so, on all sorts of platforms in all sorts of ways. So predatory advertising is a very serious problem, and these advertisers pick up data, whether it's through a third party, from, sources that no one would ever assume that would ever be provided for that purpose. So the other way you could do it is to prohibit de-identified data sharing. So one of the things about the Privacy Act is if you de-identify data, which isn't defined, then you're not required to obtain anyone's consent. I appreciate that even if you get consent, it might not be appropriate, but that's a loophole that exists in the Privacy Act, which is ridiculous, because essentially what it means is you can take off a name and address. You have to do very little to de-identify, because actually true de-identification is much more complex than that. But this is what companies currently do: take off a name and address, sell it on to somebody else, and it's a source of revenue. So what I completely agree. There's a hungry industry that looks everywhere for this data, that incentivizes businesses to monetize it, and we've got to find a way to stop it, because it's all happening under the radar. It would never meet most people's expectations of what happens to your information, and we absolutely need to find ways to undercut that market. So yeah, Dan and I are agreed. Oh my God.
Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you next.
Hey, can I have one more point? Can I have one more point on this?
Yeah.
So the other reason why I like purpose limitations in the Australian context is that, I believe, for example, that Google and Facebook should be broken up, but we can't do that from Australia. But what the beauty of purpose limitations is that you can achieve almost the benefit of that by preventing, for example, Instagram data and WhatsApp data and Facebook data being aggregated, which is what they use to power their advertising business. So you can do this from Australia. You can make a material difference to this from Australia without having to break the companies up, just by enacting effective privacy law. So I think it's the best way to solve this problem, and it's where GDPR stuffed up. Again, I might lose the floor, so I'll leave it there. But it's where GDPR stuffed up. they still allowed this collection and harvesting and aggregation to go on. We shouldn't allow it in Australia.
So Dan and Lizzie, in terms of the privacy review, you've said, Lizzie, it's very broad. It's almost like a fishing expedition. What's the thought on how could we pull something 2 or 3 sharp asks and then go and convince conservative politicians that it meets with their libertarian tendencies? Because it seems like this isn't, like, we're not preaching socialism here. We're preaching individual rights.
I'm looking forward to all the journalists now claiming how important this is. All the newfound journalists in newfound jobs talking about the importance of protecting user rights. So can't wait for the army of them to be writing stories about the importance of privacy.
You're
rather
such
than
a cynic, Lizzie. You're
just me
cynic.
screaming into the void. Me and Mark. So, you know, I think we have to, like, one of the things that I've talked about in the past is a Royal Commission into the data mining industry. In part, I think that would be useful just because then you get to see how unseemly it is, and you get to finally kind of match it against expectations. Like, there's legitimate criticisms of Royal Commissions. You know, the Banking Royal Commission did exactly that. And we're now looking at relaxing responsible lending laws. So there's a real query about how effective they are. But one of the big worries, I suppose, I've got is that the unseemly, disgusting, hugely malicious nature of data sharing, I don't think in that economy is really made plain to many people. And the more they know about it, the more contemptuous of it I think they'd be. So we do need investigative journalists looking into this kind of stuff as much as possible.
And you're right, as an academic exercise, when there's no self-interest, it's going to be hard to get purchased, but to actually illustrate not just the intellectual problem, but the real problem. I do think people get it. They get that it's creepy. I'm not sure if they get that it's how insidious it is. So
yeah.
The other interesting thing here is I think it's a real problem in having the Department of Comms running ad tech review and AGs running privacy, and there needs to be a marrying of those two, you know, processes, or you're just going to end up with kind of another industry code for advertising and then a very, very complex process through the AGs. So it feels, you know, I am also interested in what sort of appetite for government there will be. I think politically this whole little process has worked for the government. Like, I think they've, but whether there is more momentum there, I'm not sure. But time will tell, as I think we said on a number of these. Have you got any final reflections, Mark? I think I muted you because you were coughing your head off before.
Yeah, sorry about that. I mean, I agree also on the regulating use. The interesting thing about the data economy, of course, is a lot of the data mining stuff is speculative, and you end up having to chase uses, right? So, you know, you collect data and then you find out that it can be used for credit scoring or something, you know, data completely seemingly unrelated. And that means not either chasing down each use as it comes, or blanket prohibitions on secondary uses, right? Which of particular types, which really, that really cuts into a whole economic formation. And I'm all in favor of cutting into it, but I do think that's where you find a point of political resistance, because it's, you know, it potentially has economic consequences.
Yeah. We're almost up to the hour. Thanks everyone for contributing in the chat. It's been active and collaborative. Any last thoughts on where we are at this moment and what needs to happen next, Lizzie or Dan?
Well, I'm super excited for the year ahead. We've got a lot planned at Digital Rights Watch. I mean, there's a lot of policy things on the agenda, as you heard. But it's great to see spaces like this as well. I see a lot of familiar faces in the gallery, which is really lovely. And I feel like this is sort of how you build resilience also around policy reform, and you start to build movements that are diverse and capable of taking on some of these very profound questions and forcing governments to work for us rather than just big business or just whoever's in their ear lobbying them, including surveillance agencies. So, you know, that's what we need to build up our community infrastructure, to build a movement that's strong enough to argue for these kinds of agendas. So I'm pleased to see everybody, and I'm hoping you'll continue to be part of that.
Yeah, and we want ideas on how we can spread this out a bit more broadly, and how, you know, once we're up and running, we might do some physical events in play when we're allowed to do that in Sydney and Melbourne, and just start to sort of take what's become a really fun sort of virtual community that doesn't rely on Facebook support each other. Yeah, and Brisbane as well, Sarah. So hopefully this year will allow us to get to know each other a little bit better. Dan, any last thoughts for you on what comes next and what we can expect from Guardian?
Not necessarily from Guardian per se. I'd probably just echo what I said last year. It felt like 2020 was the year that the world started to sit up and take notice of some of the damage that, you know, big tech and all of this stuff that we talk about every week was, it sort of went mainstream, if you like. There's so much momentum behind this. I mean, obviously, perhaps I'm naive, but the media code, as you've pointed out many times, Peter, is the start of this process, not the end. I am encouraged that there's an ad tech inquiry being undertaken by the ACCC. I think the ACCC has proven themselves to be up for the challenge of this stuff. And I'm looking forward to seeing what their final report and recommendations are. And I hope that the government takes them seriously, or takes them as seriously as they've taken the media code. We've got the privacy review, we've got misinformation code. There's so much coming up. It feels to me like this is just going to keep gaining momentum. And perhaps I live in a bubble, but certainly in my reflections on my conversations that I have with people that don't work in media and tech, and I do know a few of them, it's becoming a much more mainstream conversation. So let's hope that conversations like this can start to happen more broadly. I guess I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Great. Hey guys, thanks for being part of it. Everyone who's in the room today. We'll do this fortnightly again this year, and on the Zoom platform, unless we find a bigger home, which we'll, who knows, we might end up on Sky After Dark if we play our cards right, Lizzie. Until then though, Political Geek Fest next Tuesday if you want to drop in, and we're also now hosting the Ozpol community and Denise Travell every couple of weeks. So we're still keeping this going a little bit less intensely than last year, but until we're all in a pub together, let's keep doing it. So have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks for being part of today.